Alright, today we're diving into something that's been on my mind for a while now. Post Malone's shift from hip-hop to country music. This transformation didn't just surprise the fans, it also sparked a lot of controversy. So I figured, let's unpack this, because the story behind this transformation is a lot. Post Malone has been popular for a minute, but his transition had people raising eyebrows. Like, how did this guy go from being one of the biggest names in hip-hop to suddenly rocking cowboy boots and singing about sunsets in the back roads? Let's get into it. When Post Malone first dropped White Iverson back in 2015, it was everywhere. I'm talking radio, playlists, commercials, you name it. The track was the perfect blend of laid-back hip-hop and a dash of something fresh, something new. His voice was melodic, the beat was smooth, and even though he wasn't the first to blend rap with melody, there was something about Post's delivery that felt different. Rockstar followed, and bam, Post was officially a global star. But what really made Post Malone stand out wasn't just his hits, it was his image. The face tattoos, the wild hair, the fact that he didn't exactly fit the typical hip-hop mold. Hip-hop's always been about authenticity, and Post Malone was an odd fit. He wasn't your typical rapper. He was just Post, and that's what people loved. He was authentic in his own way, even if his authenticity came with a bit of a question mark. At first glance, people might have written him off as a gimmick, another artist trying to ride the wave of hip-hop without really understanding its soul, and maybe he didn't get the emotional depth of the genre. His early music was all about the party life, flexing, and materialism. Stuff that's common in hip-hop, but not exactly emotionally complex. And I bring this up because more will be talked about as the video progresses. He wasn't diving into the hardships or the emotional trauma that so many hip-hop artists were at the time. Instead, Post created anthems for people to party to vibe with, but not necessarily reflect on life's deeper struggles. Now let's talk about the part where Post Malone sort of took shots at hip-hop's emotional depth. In interviews, he's made it pretty clear that he didn't exactly vibe with the emotional side of hip-hop. He once said that he was overhearing about all the pain and struggles in the genre, calling it too heavy and not for him. And while I get the idea of wanting to break away from the overly sentimental side of things, there's a bit of irony here, don't you think? It's also a bit tone-deaf considering hip-hop's relationship with struggles, whether that be economically, socially, and of course with race. On another occasion, Post Malone said, "If you're looking for lyrics, if you're looking to cry, if you're looking to think about life, don't listen to hip-hop. Whenever I want to sit down and have a nice cry, I'll listen to some Bob Dylan." Post Malone's own music at its core wasn't exactly rich in emotional depth either. His lyrics often repeated the same themes, money, fame, partying, but they weren't deep or introspective. It's one thing to reject something because it doesn't vibe with you, but it's another thing to criticize it when you're not offering much more in return. That's not to say Post Malone completely lacked emotional songs around this time in his career, but his bread and butter, much like his peers, was the very thing he had a moral high ground about. It's just an unfair generalization of a genre that has roots in deep expression of struggle just as much as partying and having fun. I do think there's something a bit meta and revelatory about one of Post Malone's biggest hits being him singing about how he feels like a rock star over a hip-hop beat. The term that has defined rock music has always been sex, drugs, and rock and roll. More than anything, rock music historically is viewed as a genre of free expression, a genre that can be risque, a genre where the rule breakers are, where the most confident individuals go, and where the heartbroken are ferociously loud. A sentiment that has far more in common with hip-hop than some rockists would like to acknowledge. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll can also be seen as cool and a measurement of authenticity. And although the ethos isn't exactly the same, there's so much overlap, and it's interesting how that connotation completely shifts present day if hip-hop is at the center of the conversation. In many ways, hip-hop stars became the new rock stars, and if anything, Post Malone's early success is indicative of that. Still, the genre was not given the same respect by someone like Post that largely benefited from it. Post Malone is okay with being perceived as a rock star, even a pop star, and now a country star, but a hip-hop artist is where he draws the line. And to add to that, Post Malone came up with a class of SoundCloud rappers and emo rappers that were literally known for spilling out their heart and topics about drug abuse and depression on record. And I think that's really what turned some people off. Here's this guy benefiting from a genre that thrives on raw emotion and struggles, yet he's making it seem like that's something to be avoided, while also dismissing the genre's emotional depth. It's like he didn't want to engage with the very soul of the genre that gave him his platform. So let's fast forward a little bit. Post Malone had his run with Stoney, Beer Bongs and Bentleys, and Hollywood's Bleedin'. These albums were huge, But by the time we hit Hollywood's Bleeding, things started to feel a little stale. Sure, there were some moments, but something wasn't clicking the way it used to. And when 12 Karat Toothache dropped in 2022, it really showed how much Post was struggling to maintain his momentum. The album just didn't perform the way his previous ones had. Critics were lukewarm about it, and fans were starting to turn their attention elsewhere. The singles didn't quite have the same impact, and the album's emotional weight didn't land the way people were hoping. The whole vibe felt off. Post Malone was still Post Malone, but that fire that had him dominating charts in the past wasn't quite there. His 2023 album, Austin, which saw him trying to go in a soft rock and synth-pop direction, was a massive flop. This is where the pivot of Post Malone really comes into play. Instead of doubling down on what wasn't working, he adapted. He took stock of where he was and saw the industry moving in a new direction. While the charts were still dominated by hip-hop and pop, country music was on the rise on the pop charts. Country music was gaining more mainstream traction. And that's when Post Malone's transformation from hip-hop to country really started to kick in. Country music was everywhere in 2024, and it wasn't just limited to traditional artists. Post Malone saw that, and he seized the opportunity. I think it had a lot to do with him staying relevant, and he could align himself with a genre that gave him a palpable transformation and popularity with a new audience, as hip-hop no longer maintained the monopoly over the charts that it first did when Post Malone first peaked. What really blows my mind is how quickly Post Malone was accepted into the country music world. I mean, I get it a little. He's got the Texas connection, and his music had already been hinting at a country influence for a while. But to see him perform at country festivals, collaborate with country stars, and get embraced by an audience that wasn't exactly waiting for a former hip-hop artist to swoop in, that was fast. Collaborating with the likes of Morgan Wallen, Blake Shelton, and Dolly Parton, it seemed like the country music world was eager to take him in. He didn't have to prove himself, he was just there, effortlessly making his mark in a genre that welcomed him with open arms. I must admit, his country act has been convincing, even if predictable and a bit stale. He has become so ingrained into the country world that you almost forget he started off as a hip-hop artist. His country act also allowed him to really build a cult following that wasn't there when his albums 12 Karat Toothache and Austin underperformed. His country album F1 Trillion performed significantly better. I think it also helps that he was ushered in by the biggest country star in the genre right now, Morgan Wallen. So here's the big question. Was Post Malone's shift to country music a career move, a true transformation, or a little bit of both? I think it's a bit of both, honestly. It does feel genuine, and it also feels like a calculated ploy for relevance to me. It makes me wonder if this was Post Malone's intention all along. Hip-hop could have very much been his means to end. A white rapper that releases a hit or something catchy is always going to get a lot of attention because they're not common. Post's hip-hop image could have merely been something to help him stand out from the crowd. His melodic approach set him up to push past hip-hop as well. There's nothing wrong with pop stars exploring different styles and genres, but once you disparage the very genre that put you on and talk down on it as if it's an inferior medium to express emotion, it makes way for a lot of criticism. Post Malone also had the privilege of leaving hip-hop behind when he felt it didn't serve his career anymore. Black artists are notoriously pigeonholed into hip-hop and R&B categories, and don't have the same exact luxury to be or at least be perceived as genreless, even if they are. One thing's for certain, only time will tell if Post Malone will treat country music like last year's Halloween costume. But he will likely never be heard in an interview talking down on country music like he did with hip-hop, even though hip-hop is solely responsible for Post Malone.